In this lesson, we're going to take a brief look at how the CFAA has been applied by looking at some of the cases and how they turned out. So as we look through some of this case law and what we've discussed before, the biggest questions the court generally have with this section, or the whole act, is what is without authorization? Or what is exceeds authorized access? This will make more sense as we go through some of the case law. On its face, you'd think it would be like a no-brainer, but because situations in law, as in life, are varied and very dynamic, and different courts have different ways of interpreting things, it becomes kind of fuzzy. All right. Okay, let's discuss the concept of authorized access. Oren Kerr, as you see on the screen, is a law professor. He wrote a journal article in 2003 basically discussing or trying to interpret the concept of authorized access, or authorized access theory. Right? That's what professors do. Specifically, this was interpreting authorized or access in computer misuse statutes. This particular journal entry or journal article tends to be referenced in court cases quite a bit when people start analyzing how the courts should deal with the concept of authorized access. Oren Kerr article I put on your class resources for this week or this lesson. You can read it if you wish. It's there. It's not required. But I'd like to go over some of the important bullet points, we'll say, which may help you look at the way the courts are interpreting the concept of authorized access. So Oren Kerr basically conceptualized there are two ways the legal system could interpret the concept of authorization of access or authorized access. The first one, what we have, basically states that the court should look at authorization based on the concept or based on technical barriers put in place. Now we're talking like technical things that are set up within the system itself to prevent any kind of access or exposure to any type of materials you're not supposed to have exposure to. The most general or basic of these would be like passwords and users' accounts. So each user account would be given certain permissions which allow access to certain parts of the system. An account password combination could limit or allow access to that system in different areas. By default, if you circumvent the authorization though, like you crack the password or you brute force guess the password, you steal accounts, that kind of thing, or even if you're in the system, you already have legitimate access to the system, and you somehow break the software or protection within the system, and you, what is called, escalate your privileges and allow you to access files you're not supposed to have access to, that's essentially what Kerr feels is one of the first ways the courts should look at the idea of authorization. Authorization based on technical barriers. Now, Kerr's second interpretation of authorization is authorization by contract. And basically, what you're allowed to do on a system based on a user agreement or something you signed. It could be one of those online I agree kind of checkblock things that we see all the time. Things most people don't read, but they just check and move on. It doesn't have to be as formal as a signature and a written contract. These are essentially those rules that are placed on a computer user who already has physical access granted to them to use the computer. Now, when we're talking about criminal law, Kerr wants to place the highest burden and basically state that the court should interpret a violation of the technical barrier as really the only way you can determine an access or authorization access violation, not this contract type. Now, why is that? Well, based on Kerr's writings, Kerr felt that categorizing a violation of something like a EULA, or an end user license agreement, or even an IT user contract as unauthorized access in the criminal courts would essentially put the law or the creation of the law in the hands of either like a network or commuter owner or a network administrator, or generally whoever makes the policies, and not the federal government. Kerr pretty much stated it grants the computer network owners too much power to regulate what the internet users do and how they do it. So basically, if you're in a company and you say you can't type between noon and 5 and you're caught doing so, you're basically violating authorized access to that network or machine. Costs saw this as something that would be a snowballing problem. These types of violations created by rules and corporations turning into a federal rule violation would really choke out the criminal courts. Thoughts basically on the CFAA and what Kerr brought up. So let's assume an online newspaper site, you can say New York Times or whatever, something like that. Post does it a lot, Washington Post. Let's say they limit a user to 5 free article views a month. After that, you're required to buy a subscription, or they want you to buy a subscription. Well, Joe Cheap Guy, just a viewer or a reader, discovers that if he deletes his browser cookies after his 5 views, he could read another 5 views, or he can read another 5 articles without any fees. He can keep doing that the whole month and read free articles. Does Joe Cheap Guy violate the CFAA or the spirit of the CFAA, right? And what do you think Kerr would think about this? Technically, Joe does violate Kerr's first rule of the authorized access when we discuss technical barriers in place. He does circumvent those. Do you think Kerr would think this was a violation of the CFAA? Just think about this for a minute or two if you want to pause it, kind of go back at what we learned about the CFAA and see how this particular situation fits within that. So when we break that situation down, bigger question, did the company put up technical restrictions on its site? Well, yeah, they basically have something up there that monitors the cookies or whatever. It probably is rudimentary, but it's there to prevent the normal everyday user from viewing more than 5 free articles. Now, was there a user agreement? We didn't get into that part of the story. And most likely something pops up on your screen that says, thanks for viewing, pay if you want to view more, that kind of thing. So a lot of this has to do with what the user is being presented with. Did Joe Bad Guy bypass a technical restriction by deleting the browser cookies? Kinda, yeah, I guess. Is that enough to be considered a hack? Well, it's a technical workaround, if you're working on your computer. And that's an interesting kind of a sidebar there. Does it count if it's on your computer and not theirs? So you're not technically doing anything to their machine. You're modifying things on your own machine in order to bypass their security. So they're using your computer for their security. That's kind of an interesting angle also. Can the website file civil suit for damages if not paying the monthly fee, let's say $30? I don't believe so, but think about that. Those are just other thoughts that we have at this point. There are limits put in with the CFAA. Another CFAA case law example, United States versus Morris. You have heard of this if you've ever heard of the Morris worm. In 1988, so we're going back a little bit, Robert Morris, he's a Cornell University graduate student. He was given an account at the Cornell and created his first worm program, basically a piece of software code that can replicate itself. And he did this as part of his graduate work to demonstrate how poor computer security was. Now, this worm kind of took advantage of some flaws Morris found within computers at the time and operating systems. The worm was designed to travel across the internet by itself and self-replicate, and he had it designed to do that, so that's some of the things he put into it. Now, the internet of 1988 wasn't what we consider the internet of now. It was basically made up of university and government networks, so it wasn't as widespread. But the goal of Morris was to spread the worm quickly but quietly, and really to cause no interference with the network or use of computers. He basically programmed the worm to be as less intrusive as possible, or least intrusive as possible. Basically avoid copying itself onto already infected machines, that kind of thing. Well, that whole thing failed. There was some miscalculations in his programming, and it went south. You can look up the details on what the Morris worm did, but it pretty much locked everything down. It replicated on machines that already had the worm, kind of shut machine, I'll call them blue screen, but locked up some important machines out there. So it was a mess. So during his research, basically Morris found flaws in several programs that existed in the current operating systems. There was the SendMail, Finger Demon. There were bugs that he located, we'll call them today, they would call like 0 days, that he knew about that nobody else did. He used different features, improperly used features that were built into the operating systems. And he was also using his worm to brute force password guess, which was kind of a workaround there also. So in the United States versus Morris, evidence was brought against Morris, basically stating that he released the worm from MIT and not Cornell to disguise who created the worm. The worm unfortunately worked too well and replicated out of control again. It killed many computers across the country. Now Morris attempted to fix the problem by anonymously sending out instructions on how to kill the worm once he found out it got out of control. He sent it, of course, he sent it from Harvard, the anonymous instructions, again, to avoid being caught. Well, he was caught and arrested. Morris was convicted, and he appealed on the grounds that there was insufficient evidence to convict him of the concept of unauthorized access. He's basically stating he had authorized access to access and use all the computers at Cornell, Harvard, and Berkeley because of his research work. He had the authorization to do that. He was authorized to use SendMail and the finger programs, etc. But the court questioned, did Morris have the right or the authorization, and did he use the software for their intended purpose? Okay, he went above and beyond his authorization by using the software for purposes other than what they were designed for. So a few important legal points of the appeals case. First off, the software, the worm, spread beyond where Morris had authorized access to. So it wasn't just Cornell, Harvard, Berkeley, which he had authorized access to. The software spread to spread to NYU, or it spread to Penn State or Mercyhurst or wherever. Other universities were affected, Department of Defense computers, that kind of thing. So that was beyond Morris's authorized access. Also, the worm was designed to bypass security, the technical limitation, by brute force and guessing passwords to get into accounts. Let's look at this a little bit. So thoughts. How does the intended function or purpose argument work here? Who or what determines the intended function of a piece of software? Oren Kerr, if he were examining this case, how would he apply the CFAA? Let's talk about one of the larger CFAA case laws, one that's used quite frequently when we talk about CFAA violations. U.S. versus Nozzle. This is U.S. versus Nozzle 1. And you can see the sections there if you wish to research it. But generally, a case summary is Nozzle worked for Company X, let's say. He had two former colleagues that were still at Company X. Nozzle left. Let me rephrase this. Nozzle worked for Company X and then left to start his own business. He had friends and former colleagues that worked at Company X still. And basically, Nozzle went to them and said, hey, can you kind of provide some information from our Company X's computers, and it'll help me start my business. So they were buddies and said, sure. Now, the colleagues who were still employed had authorized access to that computer information during the course of employment. Okay, they were doing their job. Now, Company X had a policy forbidding disclosure of the information to outside companies. So we have a policy doing that. So Nozzle was charged with numerous counts, including violations of, you'll see that, exceeding authorized access with intent to defraud. Bigger question is, what did the Ninth Circuit decide on appeal? In Nozzle, we see two different paths in which the CFAA and exceeding authorized access could be interpreted by the courts. The way the U.S. government prosecution was interpreting the case is that authorized access is granted by the network owner on to employees. And since they were doing their things against what they're authorized to do, mainly distributing work documents outside the company, it's a violation of the authorized access. Or at least at a minimum, the employees exceeded their authorized access, right? Because they violated their work agreements. The majority in the appeals courts interpreted the CFAA differently. They assessed that the legislature created the CFAA in 1984, to be exact, to address computer hacking. This was done looking at congressional debate on the law at the time, etc. And they determined hacking, which would be meaning the actual avoidance or disruption, breaking, etc., of any kind of technical measures put in place to prevent unauthorized users from accessing the system. So, what did the Ninth Circuit charge on appeal? Well, was there a hacking type action here? There was not. Okay. Now, was there a violation of work policy? Yes, there was. But you have a violation of work policy in Nozzle 1. So Nozzle did not exceed authorized access. This was an example of a very strict interpretation of the CFA, more on line with what we talked about with Kerr. So how about interpreting that section both ways? So let's say without authorization applies to outside hackers, which are individuals who really have no authorized access to the computer at all. And then we have exceeds authorized access, and that would apply to your inside hacker. Basically individuals who initial access to a computer is authorized, aka you work there, but you access unauthorized information or do something with that information against whatever internal authorization rules are applying to you. So Nozzle, the government is using the inside hacker definition to prosecute the Nozzle matter. And that didn't fly, as you saw, with these specific circumstances. Now, law professor James Grimmelman summed up the opinion of the majority with this quote, as you see on the screen. The government's construction of the statute would expand its scope far beyond computer hacking to criminalize any unauthorized use of information obtained from a computer. This would make criminals of large groups of people who have little reason to suspect they are committing a federal crime. While ignorance of the law is no excuse, we can properly be skeptical as to whether Congress in 1984 meant to criminalize conduct beyond that which is inherently wrongful, such as breaking into a computer. So basically you can see how he... Okay, so we're back to Nozzle again. So Nozzle, the government came back for a second bite at the apple with Nozzle. Now this occurred as a separate instance of a violation, same people, same players, different circumstances. In this circumstance, Nozzle and the people that were working for the company had left the company permanently. The company had deleted all their accounts. They were no longer on the books at the original company, Company X, I guess we called it. Now the partners still had friends inside, and they said, hey friend, can I borrow your account logon and use your databases? And the partners were able to get other people's accounts and log on 3 different times using the database and software. All right, so now they were no longer using their accounts they were authorized to use. They're using other people's accounts. The courts looked at it like this. In Nozzle 1, the concept of authorization wasn't in doubt. The employees had the power and authority to use the work computers. They just did so against internal policy. In this matter, Nozzle 2, all parties involved were not employed by the victim company and had all their accounts deleted. Pretty much cemented the position of the company that Nozzle and his partners were not authorized. They were now all outsiders. They called this a plain meaning interpretation of the law. The dissenting judge, of course in this case, wanted to state this matter was just simply password sharing, and while it would be a violation of policy, it should not be a federal crime. So one of the judges who dissented basically went back to, hey, this is just another rule violation. They shared a password. These other people just used the password, the other employees. So basically that's the difference here. You basically have people without access utilizing their computers and their resources, as opposed to the initial one where they had access. Again, the insider versus the outsider. So let's take a hypothetical. You have a Netflix account and you give the login information to your parents so they can watch whatever. Are they now considered federal criminals? What's the difference between Nozzle 2 and the Netflix scenario? Is it about the motives and intent? Okay, one last case example. WEC, Carolina Energy Solutions versus Miller, and you'll see the section up there if you're interested in researching the full case briefings, but a general synopsis. We have employee Mike. He basically copied data from his employer, WEC, regarding some projects and some other things, other work material. He then left the company to work for a competitor of WEC's. He took these materials and used the material he got from WEC to, gain new clients and make more business for the competitor. So that's basically just the gist of the whole thing. So in WEC, the court differentiated between the sections charged because he was charged with 3 different counts. They used what is called the ordinary meanings of the concepts. Authorization, basically meaning to have approved access to the computer. Without authorization, access to a computer without authorization. And then exceeding authorized access went beyond essentially what the users were approved access to. All right. So the courts didn't have any problem with two of the counts, but one of the counts, basically, they questioned what he did with the materials after he accessed them. And they didn't have any problem with the exceed authorized access, basically stating that while you were authorized to access the material, you exceeded it by taking copies of it out and using it for other purposes. But one of the charges tried to interpret how the information was used, and the courts in this case said you cannot kind of shoehorn improper use of information that was accessed validly into without authorization or exceeding authorized access. All right, that's not built into that section. So that was kind of the big ruling in WEC, was how the information used cannot be made illegal by these statutes at this point.